I want to welcome everybody to the 2021 season of the Red River Apiarist Association Winter Prep Seminar. This is not a regular meeting, so there will be no minutes and there will be no standard protocol. It's very much a bullpen kind of question and answer and roundtable kind of discussion on winter prep, where you're at, what your techniques are at, what has worked for you, what has not. We are joined here today by Derek Mickelson, who is the main guy for KRTP, and our provincial apiarist, Riel Lafreniere. They have limited time this evening. Thank you very much, you guys, for joining us. So we are going to call on them towards the beginning of the meeting. That way, if they do have to leave early, well, because God knows you get enough beekeepers in a room, it's almost like perpetual motion. They will talk and talk and talk until the sun comes up. And so if they have to leave early, we want for them to be able to share observations and knowledge early, so we can get the most benefit of it. So I guess how I wanted to start off was with Riel. Riel, can you unmute your mic for a second?
Yeah, it should be unmuted.
Yeah. How I wanted to start off was you had put out, as provincial apiarist, sort of a bulletin about the drought and how winter practices, we may want to think about accelerating that timeline. And, of course, Murphy's Law, a few days later, it rains, which unfortunately may have really rocked people back, going, oh, okay, it rained, everything will be kind of sort of back to normal, which is not, as much as we all wish it would be true, it's not. So can we start off with maybe you giving a bit of an overview of that bulletin and how it still sort of applies for now?
Yeah, I think that was really kind of an extension alert to let people know that, given the conditions that we were going through with that drought, that it was very important that they keep a close eye on their colonies, to assure that they don't shut down early, like the whole flow shut off. And if you're running singles, you could easily, starve them if you don't pay attention. So it was really to kind of get people aware, to kind of keep a close eye that this honey flow could end very, very quickly. And if the drought would have continued, there would be very little food out there. Some areas got some decent rain, and I agree with you. I don't think you shouldn't be too comfortable with what's going on there, but this rain will certainly help. Some of those later flowering wildflowers that typically, kick into high gear in this latter part of the summer, like the August and September period. If they got this rain, they might produce a little bit of nectar, but probably more importantly, the pollen might be around if we get some recovery in these areas. Some areas didn't get much rain, so it's still kind of, you have to look at your own specific area. I had the great fortune of driving all the way up to Swan River today. So if I look a little dozy, it's because I drove 11 hours today. And I could tell you up there, it's a completely different situation than around Winnipeg. There was so much wildflower in the ditches but they got rains. They got rains when a lot of areas of Manitoba were not getting rain. And they got another dousing just last night. So they're actually not in a bad situation, but I still think that there's a lot of areas in Manitoba that are probably not going to get much of a fall flow, whether it's a trickle flow, which is just a minor amount of nectar available to kind of keep the bees going. In some areas, that's not even going to be there. So I had to make this alert very generic, where it was meant as a big broadcast for the entire province. So I just really want people to realize that they have to kind of look at their own conditions in there where they keep bees to try to know how much they would have to feed or not. So it was to kind of stimulate that, and it was to explain why we don't want our bees to shut down too early, because we need them to kind of keep on going. And we normally prepare our bees in the month of September. And for the winter bees, which I kind of explained in that bulletin, you don't want to produce those winter bees too early, because they might not even live long enough as a winter bee to really kickstart that hive the following spring. So we really need our winter bees to get produced in September and into October, or the latter part of August, not the beginning of August. So that's what it was really meant to do. And the other part to that was, if you're going to feed them, be a little cautious about feeding them too. You don't want to turn August into September right away, because if you start slapping on the feed too quickly, you will also shut them down or crowd them out, especially if there's not a natural flow out there. Brood production will start to slow down regardless. You just don't want it to slow down too much. That's why you want to stimulate it. So give them enough food to kind of stimulate them, but don't let them plug up with feed either, because you're going to be defeating the purpose of what we're trying to do. Is we're trying to get them to continue to brood rear. And if you slap on, 2 pails of syrup on them right away, as soon as the brood gets, emerges, they're going to fill up that cell with food, and you're going to keep on making that brood nest smaller and smaller. And when you finally get to September, they're only going to have like 1 or 2 frames of brood to produce all the winter bees that you need for that year. So that's why you don't want to overfeed them as well too. But for pollen, you can give them, a decent amount of pollen. And sometimes we get pollen bound in the spring, but it's much less likely to occur in the fall. So giving them extra pollen at this point is not really going to plug them up. So I wouldn't worry too much about pollen. There was a hand up.
I was just going to ask about extra pollen. Like if you put pollen near the hives, they're obviously going to take what they need and leave the rest.
Yeah.
But is it a good idea?
Yeah, I don't think it's a bad idea, but again, you have to look at your area, and if they're still bringing in pollen, if they've got access to some plants that there's pollen on them, you'll still see those bees coming to your entrance with pollen on them. Or you look inside your hive, and if you're running doubles and you've got like 5 frames with pollen on them, you've got more than enough pollen.
So yeah, I'm just running a single, and I didn't see a lot of pollen, so I put some out.
Then it wouldn't be a bad idea to put some out. Yeah.
Generally speaking, for feeding pollen in the fall, and even with feeding in the fall, the key here is observation. Like people will turn around, like Riel said, and you slap feed on. Like it's not that you should be feeding or feeding is bad. It's like it's about volume and knowing what your colony needs. If you do choose to feed pollen, generally taking their fussy with pollen, they'll take it if they need it, but if they can get it in the wild, that's what they prefer. With feed though, they're gluttons. They'll take it, they're opportunistic. And if you don't go throwing on like a 15-kilo honey pail full of feed when you could probably doing, Boardman feeder, seeing what they take, but you still have to go into that brood nest and see where they're putting it. And if they are suddenly backfilling everything, then you've got to throttle back or stop feeding for a few days, and not, it's not an on-off switch, it's a dimmer switch. But you have to know what's going on with what they're bringing in and what's blooming in your area. Like I said, if we could just write a handout in a Bible, like, no, August 13th, you should be doing, check these boxes. It never, ever works that way. Yeah. And the problem with a lot of some of the material that especially new beekeepers get swamped by is a lot of YouTube videos from people of different geography, which this works here. Well, where is here? Here, it could be Georgia. Well, guess what? Beekeepers that, you know, if you could do a reality show where you just switch 10 beekeepers that, you know, middle of Interlake Manitoba compared to like middle of Georgia, everyone's bees would die because it is a huge, it's a huge adjustment. Also, Riel, I just wanted to touch bases on bears. This has been a drought-like summer. I'm pretty sure berry production hasn't been fantastic, which is a huge bear food source. Have you heard anything about increase of bear issues?
Yes, there's been a lot of bear issues. So I think this year will be the highest claims that we've had in a long time. So because there's a bear damage or a wildlife damage compensation program, and I know that they've been very busy because there's been bears attacking yards that they've never had bear problems with before. So the bears' territories are huge. They're just trying to get as much feed as possible. And you're right, the berry crop has definitely been affected by it. And I will say that the pails of syrup will be very tasty to a bear as well too. So if they hit a yard at this time of the year, they will consume everything they possibly can get their hands on.
Yeah.
And on that note with feed, and again, every area might be a slightly different. I'll just say for, you know, Rael Lafreniere, the beekeeper, I'm along the floodway, and even though I pulled my honey off at the end of July to extract it, I left a little bit of honey behind, the partially filled supers, and we went out to extract, and we came back, and those partially filled supers were basically full of honey again. And I was complaining that when we pulled off our honey, they were robbing like crazy. And I just got reminded again that they could be robbing, but they could still be bringing in honey. So just the fact that you see some robbing activity doesn't mean that there is no honey flow out there. It just is probably not an intense honey flow. So we filled up another box and we had to super them again. So I personally will probably not be feeding any, sugar feed like syrup in the month of August. I would actually prefer to leave a little bit of honey behind, postpone my final extraction, just so that they can kind of consume that honey a little bit. I know sugar is cheaper than honey, but the nice thing about having a honey super on is that if you got a partial honey super on, if they need that feed, they'll take it. And if they're in a bit of a flow, they'll continue to fill it. And that kind of gives you an idea how much feed they really need. And the other part to that is that if there is a bit of a flow, they're not plugging up your brood chamber if you do have a super on it. So there's a fine line. If your hives don't really have access to any food and you need to syrup feed them, you're feeding your brood chambers. But if you're in a little bit of a flow, it might be better to have that honey super with a little bit of honey in it, so that that they're not going to plug up your brood chamber. Because again, you don't want to compromise that brood production at this time. You really want to continue to replace those bees that have been working really hard during the summer, because they're not going to live very long. So you want to make sure that there's still a population, that's strong enough to take down that feed that you want them to survive the winter with. I think there was another hand up here somewhere.
I was just going to ask, like towards winter, once you've wintering with a single brood chamber, how much honey would you leave, or feed would you leave on?
Well, I'll get on my soapbox. Many of you that have been around this club for a long time probably heard me. I don't think honey is the best feed for bees for winter. So I would take off, not from the brood chamber. You don't steal honey out of the brood chamber. You just leave whatever's there.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't leave a honey super with a bunch of honey for the bees to survive on winter with. And it's just because we have an extremely long winter, And when they feed on some of that honey, it is a more complicated diet. It's probably a better diet for them, but because it's more complicated, it produces more byproduct. They'll build up fecal matter in their stomach all the way through the winter, and it often can result in dysentery. Some honeys are better than others, but some actually can be very hard on the bees. And because honey granulates, some honeys granulate really, really hard, they need to liquefy that honey to really consume it. Whereas when you feed sugar syrup, it never granulates or forms super hard, rock hard feed for them to try to consume. So in reality, in Manitoba, a sugar syrup winter feed is probably the best quality feed you can put into your bees.
With antinosema. What's the? I can't think of it right now.
Yeah.
Fujimela.
Fumagillin, yeah.
Yeah. So candied sugar with Fujimela.
No, fumagillin is usually added to into liquid feed.
Okay.
I think you could fold it into candy. I don't know if it would be as effective because
that's not on the label at all.
Okay.
You have to stay away from making up your own concoctions.
Yeah. Oh,
there's a label that has how you feed fumagillin, and it's in a syrup form, in a liquid form. Yeah.
Now, and just also to clarify, because we always have hammered this home, is you shouldn't be feeding bees and having a honey super on. Well, you shouldn't, but when you break that rule down, you shouldn't be extracting honey from that. If you're putting on, let's say, a buffer super just so that they've got, they're not backfilling their brood chamber, even if you're feeding with fumagillin, you mark those supers or you use those supers just for that specific task. You let them rob them out afterwards or in the spring. You just don't keep those supers, especially if you're using antibiotics, you don't keep those supers in your regular rotation, and those supers have a specific task at hand. But it's like people, well, I didn't want to treat because I had, or I didn't want to feed because I still had this honey super on, or you got to break down that rule a little bit. So if there's a little bit of confusion there, keep in mind it's what you're doing with that couple of frames of feed honey that gets stored in that super. It's not that that's verboten. It's just that, don't eat that. That's just
oh no, this is my first year, so I have absolutely no idea.
No, and Riel is very right, where you're gonna get this guerrilla beekeeping cookbook of how I deal with my mites, and YouTube's full of that stuff. And
absolutely.
But those labels are exact because that's where the manufacturer guarantees efficacy, right? And if you're, let's say, making feed candy, that involves high heat, or that can involve a process which either negates or changes that treatment, which can then make it ineffective or lethal or God knows what. I'm not a chemist, but you don't, we get a handout from the provincial apiarists every year or about treatment practices, and that is something that you really shouldn't deviate away from.
And I've been told that I've treated with Apivir last year. Now I need to do something else, and I would like to know what I need to do next.
Yeah, we're gonna get to that. We're gonna no, it's okay. It's a broad topic, and I appreciate you raising the question because it's really important. But before we get to that, there was a question in chat about what happens if you do have a bear cause damage into one of your yards. Brad answered that in the chat, but Brad, can you quickly just burn through that? Brad?
Yeah, sorry, I was pushing the wrong button.
No problem.
I don't have the specifics at hand. Riel might actually, but I think I would start by calling my local natural resources office. And the one thing I've been told specifically is don't touch anything. You can't go clean up the mess. That you have to call them. They have to come out and see it. Is what I've been told. And maybe Riel, if there's if you know differing information, you can fill in on that.
Yeah, you can contact, you know, somebody that's from conservation or from wildlife. You could also contact MASC, Manitoba Agricultural Services Corporation. They're the one that administer the program, so they're very familiar with it, but they will probably get somebody that's part of that other conservation branch to come out. The other thing, the program's called the Wildlife Damage Compensation Program. So if you Google that, you will get some more, you know, information about the actual program. I've also been told that you don't clean up, but if you had to do some kind of cleanup because they weren't coming right away, contact them as soon as possible. And then if they tell you to clean up, they'll probably ask you to take some photos of stuff. So before you do any kind of cleanup, make sure you document it as best as you possibly can. But you should really wait for them to tell you to clean it up.
Yeah, no, it's like an insurance claim, you know, in every sense of the word, is where, yeah, proof is very important. And, but also they evaluate damage by the pictures that you'll be sending or the video that you'll be sending. Just turning around and saying, oh no, I had a bear wipe out 5 colonies, yuck. They're not going to be cutting checks on just on your say so. And there is a quite a process. And I have, it's a good program, and it provides needed compensation, because when a bear goes through your yard, it's horrific. They don't go after, they don't just take a colony, they'll knock the hell out of everything, because a lot of the times they're going after the brood, not just the honey. But you know, I think they compensate for the woodenware and they compensate for the bees. They don't necessarily compensate for the crop, but I could be wrong.
They'll compensate for what was in the hive at the time. So there's a little bit of an assessment of lost honey at the time, but they don't compensate future production or anything like that. So
yeah, so bear attacks in the spring are a hell of a lot more expensive than, yeah, because you kind of lose that potential.
And to clarify, I believe that this qualification for this isn't limited to size of operation or anything. It's if you have a loss, you have a loss. That's correct, isn't it?
Yeah, smaller beekeepers can access this program. The winter insurance program is only available to commercial beekeepers.
Cool. So Laura, I hope that answers your question. Derek Mickelson of KRTP.
Can I just say one more thing
For sure.
about the feeding and stuff like that? Just so it's right here, so I got to get it out, or else it's going to be gone.
Shoot.
I just wanted to kind of caution people that if we're in a situation where some people may be feeding, some people may be still chasing honey, this is the type of year where if you're feeding, make sure it's going directly on the hive, not setting up feeding stations to feed the guy that is still collecting honey, because his bees or her bees will come to your feeding stations and basically bring in sugar syrup into his honey supers, which he still plans to extract, or she plans to extract. So if you're going to feed, you know, use the Boardman feeders or a hive top feeder or a pail. Don't set out feeding stations for syrup.
Yeah. No,
and certainly don't medicate that syrup that's available, you know, like that either. So
so when would you do a cutoff date? Like, I mean, urban beekeeping especially, because there could be colonies like 3 blocks away. In a rural setting, there, of course, you know, the forage range can be a few kilometers. When do you turn around and go, okay, there, if there isn't really a flow in your area, how do you draw that line between being a good beekeeping neighbor and a bad beekeeping neighbor? Like, where, you know, because of course now you're going to get heads butting because, well, I need to feed my bees now because they're starving, and I wanted to medicate them, when someone, you know, a mile down the road is like, whoa, wait, I've got wetland here, and they're still picking up. Like,
Or most of the time it's a matter of that they haven't had a chance to take off their supers yet. So they're not actually intending to chase the honey crop intensively. They just haven't gotten around to pulling off their supers. But if there's medicated feed generally available, you can't tell those bees you can't touch that stuff. They're gonna do what they're gonna do. But I don't think that there is a cutoff date per se. But I think this is where, if you, for good, beekeeping etiquette, if you know that you have neighbors very near you, it really behooves you not to put out a feeding station style, no buffet feeding of your bees in the fall. You really have to put your feed directly on your hives, and pails leak and all that, but that's a minimal kind of concern compared to putting out a barrel full of feed, in a bee yard, which, in a rural landscape, commercial beekeepers do that, and there's no real regulations or even policies against that right now. So,
well, and it also, on the other foot, if you're leaving your honey on the colony for as long as you possibly can, keep in mind that there might be people out there wanting to get onto their feeding program, and they do yard feed, where, if you want to keep your honey pure, is when it comes down to, especially in rural, when you're dealing with large numbers of colonies and there is work to be done. And if you've got 15 colonies in a side yard 3 clicks away, they may not wait to put out medicated yard feeding, and now your honey can be compromised. So you do have to be aware of what's going on in your area as well, and you have to beekeep accordingly. But very good point, Real.
And I would just say, just as a rule of thumb, September 1 is fall management. You should be switching over to fall management. So if you're getting to the end of August, and you haven't stripped down, you really need to strip down and start thinking fall management. So if you want a date, when you should stop, treating your hives like summer hives, I would say that's the last week of August. That's the latest you should go. And I think if there's any blessing in this situation that we're in right now, if there really is a limited honey flow towards the end of August, I think this will give us the opportunity to make that switch into fall management just maybe a week earlier, and just get some of your fall work done a little bit earlier. Start your mite monitoring a little bit earlier, and then potentially start your treatments a little bit earlier as well too.
Yeah.
Can I throw something in, John?
Yeah, quickly, sure.
Yeah, quickly. You just heard a term kind of being thrown around here, and to me, my opinion, and this actually came from Riel some time ago in conversations, medication and open feed does not go together. Medication to me never belongs in an open feeder, or something like that. So just wanted to kind of throw that out there.
Well, it does make sense, right? Because if you're trying to get a certain amount of milligrams or grams of fumagillin into your colony, but you're just doing it by extrapolating the numbers into an open feed barrel, how do you know your weaker colonies and your stronger colonies are obviously going to get the wrong dosage? So, I firmly agree. You got to, you should be fine tuning that and
your neighbors too.
Oh,
and
sure.
Even wild bees, the jackets, the bald-faced hornets and stuff, they don't need that stuff.
No, and it's not cheap. It's not cheap.
Yeah.
I just wanted to call. It's 8:30, and I wanted to call on Derek Mickelson for a couple of minutes. Derek, could you unmute your mic if you're not?
Hello.
Hey, thank you very much for joining us. I know your life is a lot more hectic than usual these days. So hey,
It is
Um,
indeed. Yeah. For those that don't know, I just had a baby a couple weeks ago, and so like Royale, I'm a little worse for wear today, and need to catch up on some sleep, but doing well. So,
well,
uh,
it gets better. Actually, I'm lying. It doesn't. So, but no, it's yeah, from all of us here, absolutely. Like, congratulations, and thank you for taking an hour out of the busy schedule, especially this time of year, and with your new family. I wanted to I wanted to give you the floor for a few minutes for a few things. I noticed a bulletin came out for the Mitathon. If you could touch base on that, and also because you do have a lot of information coming in from throughout the province, just kind of your opinion on the season, because some of it was the drought was more location specific and hardship for others than others, and but just if I could get your overall perspective on how this season is and where we're at.
Sure. Yeah. So maybe I'll start with the Mitathon. Yeah. So an email got sent around yesterday, I believe. The North American Mitathon is so there was the spring session back in April, May, or I think in May, and so the summer session is going to be starting on Saturday. And basically, what the Mitathon is just a time to really encourage beekeepers throughout North America just to monitor mites in their colonies, and we can collect data from around North America to see where hotspots are for mites, and who's doing well. So the more beekeepers that can participate in this program, the better. So, and it also just encourages beekeepers to get out there and monitor their colonies, and practice some of those different monitoring methods. The alcohol wash is probably the best method for, the most accurate method if you're going to be doing it in the field. But you can use something like the sugar shake as well. Maybe not quite as accurate as the alcohol wash, but that method, you're not going to be killing bees either. And some people prefer to go with that. But the main point with that Mitathon is just to monitor your mites and know what your levels are going into the fall, and you can make better treatment decisions, and just know what you're dealing with. So that is starting on Saturday, and it runs for 2 weeks. So within those 2 weeks, beekeepers are encouraged to monitor, get your mite levels, and just upload them. So I sent John an email on that. So I don't know if you
That email is actually going out later this evening to the membership, but I just ran out
so
of time today.
there'll be a link within there of the webpage that you can actually go on and just upload your mite levels there, and it all gets sent to a centralized database somewhere down in the States. So yeah, as many people as possible that can monitor their mite levels and upload them, that'd be great. If you have any questions, you can always contact me on that. So yeah, I guess I'll just I won't really touch much on the drought. Like, I was around the province and just hearing different things from different areas. Some beekeepers were not super affected by it, and I talked to some beekeepers up in the Interlake that were having the best year they've ever had, and the Interlake was supposedly one of the worst hit areas this year for the drought. So I think it really depended on exactly where you were, and how hard hit your operation was, and how well you came out of the winter, and what your bees were looking like in the spring. One thing I will touch on though is so the KRTP, we started the bee health monitoring program this spring. And so I had a bunch of different beekeepers from around the province signing up for this program, where I would come out and sample their colonies for diseases. So they could sign up for Varroa monitoring, nosema, there's viruses they could sign up for, and then there's an AFB and EFB diagnostic that the National Bee Diagnostic Center was performing that diagnostic. So I would send those samples out to Alberta. But within that program, what we actually found basically right across the province, quite high nosema levels this spring. So, you know, it's kind of a little bit hard to know, just because we don't have good historical data from the last about 10 years or so with the provincial lab not really being open, and you know, not really collecting all that data. We don't really have much to compare that to, but in talking to RRAA, and it does seem that the nosema levels this year were quite high and possibly worrisome. The average nosema level in the province, so I would collect samples, like a pooled sample for each yard for the beekeepers signing up for this. So the average was 5 million spores per bee. And that ranged from 0 all the way up to the highest was about 17 million spores per bee. So that was, you know, quite high nosema levels. And in some cases that was, you know, pretty strongly correlated with their winter losses when we were seeing those really high levels. But in and around like 3 million, 4 million, we weren't really seeing colonies that were really struggling too much. In general, they looked okay, and they seemed to be doing well. Some colonies were struggling a little bit more than others, with, you know, some levels up and around the 6 million mark. But you know, right now the threshold for nosema treatment is 1 million spores per bee. So I know a lot of beekeepers out there aren't really monitoring for nosema, and they kind of don't know what these levels are, and myself included. And you know, I submitted some of my own samples, and they were a little bit higher than I thought they would be. But this might be just something that beekeepers around the province need to be a little bit more vigilant of, because it does seem that right across the province, these levels were quite high. So I'll actually be going back to see these beekeepers, the same beekeepers, this fall. So it'll be interesting to see what these levels are like coming out of the honey flow and coming into the fall. But that was kind of the most interesting thing that came out of that bee health monitoring program. With that program, I also did a lot of hygienic behavior testing around the province, and we saw a few really good hygienic colonies, and I was able to, you know, help beekeepers fine-tune their selections for actually selecting for their queen breeding operations. Just some other stuff I've been working on is just setting up the KRTP research apiary. We have 2 sites going now. We've got about 80 colonies, and we'll be doing some oxalic acid research in the fall. Yeah, I mean, the main thing, I guess, that I would like to drive home for just preparing for the winter and coming out of the honey flow is just to monitor for your mites, and coming out of the honey flow, you know, sample your colonies, know what your mite levels are, and you can really, you know, make some smart treatment decisions. You know, use the economic thresholds that have been put out. You know, Dr. Curry's done a lot of research on the economic thresholds. There's a good document on that. I did send out some Varroa resources earlier in the spring, so maybe I'll get those circulated around again, and people can have a look at those economic thresholds. Dave, did you have a question? Saw your hand up.
You're gonna have to unmute.
Hi, Derek. Yeah. I just what's a good strategy with regards to nosema for overwintering? Like I think we did well last year, but I think we got lucky.
Yeah, so I mean, right now the treatment threshold is 1 million spores per bee. I know, you know, it does take a microscope to be able to diagnose nosema, and most beekeepers don't have a microscope.
I gotta say, like, you can see trends, and you can tell if a hive is doing well or not. And fumagillin and you can tell if it's working?
Yes and no. I mean, oftentimes you'll apply a treatment and you don't really know if it's working or not, and you may not see a really strong difference. But one thing I'll say is that the vet diagnostic center here in Manitoba is open for beekeepers to submit samples directly, and they do nosema testing. For one sample, it's about $23, I think. So you have to make an appointment with them to drop off a sample, and you have to pay when you drop your sample off. But beekeepers can access that service. So that would be a good way of just double checking and seeing what your nosema levels are. When you do apply a treatment in the fall, that doesn't really mean you're going to be safe in the springtime. Oftentimes, you'll bring down your nosema levels in the fall, and you'll be okay going through the winter, but those nosema levels often come right back up in the springtime, and you'll likely have to treat again in the spring.
Is that not somewhat a quality of the feed you're giving your bees?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. It can be in the springtime when there's some, really fresh feed coming in. Nosema levels will drop naturally as the spring progresses, and as there's good quality feed coming into the hive, and they're able to go on cleansing flights and cleanse those nosema spores out of their guts. Those nosema levels will drop naturally. But if they're starting off the springtime with really high levels, then you probably want to think about applying a treatment.
So what gets those levels high during the winter?
Just the fact that they're not able to get out of the hive and cleanse those spores out of their guts.
Right.
Yeah, if they have higher levels going into the winter in their guts, those spores are going to be regenerating over the winter, and those levels are going to increase over the winter.
Riel, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I was just going to put a couple comments with that just to kind of support what Derek was saying. In regards to being able to tell if your bees have nosema, in the fall, it is extremely hard to be able to determine whether your hives are high in nosema or not. And it's usually has to do more with what they're doing at that time of the year. And you can tell when a hive is struggling with nosema in the spring, because brood production tends to kind of flatline, where you're getting brood production, but you're not really seeing a lot of extra adult bees. So the population just kind of stays the same, but you're seeing brood production. That's often a very good sign of nosema. And we used to go by in the wintertime, the amount of dysentery. But again, dysentery can be caused by poor quality feed, but nosema used to cause dysentery as well too. But the dominant kind of species of nosema that we're dealing with right now is Nosema ceranae, which they call the dry nosema. And it's not that correlated to, extra fecal matter on the hive. So it's not easy to determine whether your hive is affected or not. And your number one thing, what nosema does, is it really expedites the process of the bee going from, a young bee that has, good glands to raise brood, right to kind of an old age foraging bee. And it really affects that vitellogenin, and that's what is the lifespan of the bee. So it shortens that lifespan of the bee. So that's one of the biggest things about nosema, is that if you've got a bad case of that, you've already got bees that are probably not going to live as long as they should. So it's a bad thing to have high nosema in the fall. Most years we have relatively low nosema in the fall, because when you have a very good diet during the summer, the nosema levels typically go down. But if you're starting off with bad levels and they haven't gone down, so I think Derek's work this fall on monitoring these colonies, if they're still sitting high, this would be a year to put fumagillin in your treatment, in your syrup this year. It might be worth the money.
No,
if it's widespread.
No, very good point. That of course, is for sale both at Dancing Bee and at Bee Supply on Bee Made. You do not need a prescription for that, if I'm not mistaken.
No, you don't. I've got some already.
Yeah. So it's now, that being said, diagnosis many times is a process of elimination, right? So if you've got a hive that isn't doing well, and you've checked your mite levels and your mite levels are fine, and it doesn't really seem to be a queen issue. And if you do suspect that it is nosema, then spend the $23 and know, right? Because there are a lot of beekeepers that will treat prophylactically, especially because fumigillin is fairly cheap. But keep in mind, knowing where your bees are health-wise is always the biggest tool in your kit. And so if you do suspect the nosema is an issue, the lab will take your sample, and I think the turnaround's pretty quick, isn't it? About 7 to 10 days.
Yeah, it's usually within a week. Yeah.
Yeah. But so consider that in your wintering protocol. Was there any other details you wanted to share, Derek? That I know one eye is stuck to the clock. I appreciate the fact that you're able to dedicate an hour. We just kind of want to squeeze everything we can out of you for that time. But as well, I mean, if there's anything, especially if there's a topic of Q&A, if there's anything you also wanted to share, we could just move on. Or
I would like to grill a little bit with Derek on his wintering ideas.
Okay, well, we've got an agenda there, so
okay. Sorry.
And again, Derek it comes from a beekeeping background. It's one of the most attractive attributes for his KRTP resume, but there is lots of details to go through. If we are sliding into the wintering setup or your wintering program, I think it could be generally agreed that step one is that you should have your honey pulled off your colonies. If there isn't a flow on, the majority of your honey should be pulled off your colonies, because really you can't be treating effectively for mites, even with soft organic acids, where it's, you're not using miticides, so you're not worried too much about contaminants. Your honey should be off. And then it's all about mite treatments and mite monitoring. Now, what happens is we get into a situation,
excuse me,
we get into a situation where what happens is we're very, very busy with the honey flow, and our mite monitoring has a tendency to get pushed off to the side. And so when I ask people, hey, where are your mites at? What's your mite count? And I get this deer in the headlights look, as I really, really start to get worried, because you should be able to have a very basic knowledge of where they are any time of the year. And that's even, it doesn't mean you have to be doing sugar rolls or washes every time you visit your colonies. But if you're, let's say, scraping excess drone brood, taking a minute to go pick through them to see if you're seeing any mite infestation, just doing visual looks to see if there's anything crawling through the frames, you should have a handle on it. What I've been hearing from a multitude of beekeepers this year is that the mite count's very low. Like, it was low in the spring and it was low throughout the fall. It was suggested that perhaps a lot of the heat had something to do with that. I don't know if there's a correlation there. But it's almost, the problem with really low mite counts, especially throughout the busy part of the summer, is it provides this sort of this docile reaction to beekeepers where, no, I don't have a mite problem. Everything was fine in the first week of August. But as the queen starts shutting down and as your brood nest gets smaller and smaller, all those mites that you didn't see that were completing their or furthering their life cycle in the actual brood themselves. Because there's less brood, now there's more mites running around, and that gives us a bit more of an accurate picture of what's going on. There's a reason why they do these mite-a-thons when they do them, which is starting this Saturday, because this is where higher mite, this is where they don't hide so well. This is where they're a lot more active. And so when we're talking about our winter programming, the first thing on the agenda is treating. If the honey flow is over and your honey production is pretty much well done, you should get your supers off your colonies, and you should start treating for mites, whatever that may be. And that branches off onto a number of things, because every treatment is a little bit different. Your soft organic acids, such as oxalic, right, are pretty quick. You're dealing with trickling or vaporizing, and that's you're hitting the mites, and it won't be interrupting your feeding because that would be the step right after. The same with formic acid. You're looking at a number of days instead of compared to miticide strips like Apistan or Jesus, someone chime in. Apistan or
Checkmate or
Checkmate
Apivar.
or Apivar. Now I think Checkmite's Kumafloss. Am I wrong?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. I don't know if you can actually get Kumafloss anymore. Jesus, that stuff scares the hell out of me. I wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. But the general weapons of choice are either Apistan or Apivar. Now, Apivar, it's not recommended that you use that during feeding, but because it is thymol based, and someone please slap me if I'm wrong, it can be used during feeding, although not recommended. Apistan, you should not. Now, those treatments can be up to 45.
That's not Apivar, that's Apilifevar.
Apilifevar. Okay, so thank you for correcting me. If it's thymol based, then it's almost like a soft acid or a soft organic treatment. But the miticides, the Apistan and the Apivar, you should not. So you are looking at 45 days. So that means you want to get that treatment fairly quickly. All of these treatments have pluses and all of these treatments have minuses, but the big thing is efficacy, right? If you treat with formic acid, for instance, or oxalic acid, and you check your mites load afterwards, or you've checked your drop afterwards and you weren't getting the results, then you can turn around and you can repeat the process and you still haven't used up a lot of your time window. When you are putting in miticide strips, you're putting a huge brake on where those strips work by the bees will be mingling around and that miticide will be sort of spread throughout the brood chamber, but it really relies on new bees hatching out and those mites getting destroyed. So it needs to go through a couple of brood cycles for maximum efficacy. And I don't care what you treat with, you definitely have to check afterwards to ensure that those mite treatments worked, because there's too many tales of beekeepers. Well, I treated for mites, it couldn't be mites. Well, guess what? It was mites, and now you've got dead outs, and there was time to intervene, and it is all about monitoring. So you're looking at step one, getting your honey off your colonies, step two, getting your mites treated, and then we can talk about feeding. And everyone's a little bit different when it comes to their time frame, when it comes to and that is because, you know, if you have a day job or if you're running 400 or 600 colonies compared to 6, your time constraints are going to be a little bit different. So you have to tailor your wintering program into what is the best for you and your bees, because running out of time or life gets in the way, or, you know, whatever is going on in the non-beekeeping section of your life, the mites just don't care. They just don't. They don't care if you're moving. They don't care if you got a new job or a new baby or a promotion at work or anything like that. They're just going to keep on doing what they're doing. And let's face it, nukes in the spring are pretty bloody expensive this year compared to the outlay of what you're going, you know, of time and treatment costs for fall mite programs.